The little soldiers. Every Sunday, the moment they received their leave, the two young soldiers would set off. Having left the barracks, they would immediately turn right and march in step through the streets of Courbevoie, as if they were still on parade. But no sooner had they left the city's buildings behind than their pace would slow on the dusty, dreary highway leading to Bezons. Short and scrawny, they were utterly drowned in their immensely long greatcoats, the sleeves of which swallowed their hands, and they stumbled in their dark red, billowing trousers, so wide that they had to splay their legs to walk quickly. And from under their rigid, cumbersome shakos peered pitiful, gaunt faces, the simple faces of Bretons, glowing with an almost animal-like gentleness and clear, calm, blue eyes. On the road, they kept silent, walking steadily onward, united by a single thought that took the place of conversation, for they had found a spot on the edge of the Champieu wood that reminded them of their native land, and it was only there that they truly came to life. At the crossroads of the paths leading to Colombes and Chatou, they would take off their oppressive shakos under the shade of the trees and wipe their damp foreheads. At the Bezons Bridge, the little soldiers would always pause, mesmerized by the view of the Seine. They would stand like that for a minute or two, leaning over the stone parapet, or follow with their eyes the vast expanse of the Argenteuil basin, where the slanting white sails of clippers glided. And in those moments, they probably recalled the Breton Sea, the port of near their native village, and the frail little fishing boats setting off across the Gulf of Morbihan into the open vastness. After crossing the Seine, they would pop into the local shops to buy provisions from the butcher, the baker, and the wine merchant. A piece of blood sausage, a quarter loaf of bread, and a liter of cheap red wine. That was their entire Sunday ration, which they carefully wrapped in a bundle. The moment they had passed the village, they slowed their pace, and their tongues were immediately loosened. Before them stretched a wretched valley with sparse clumps of trees, and ahead lay a wood, a small copse, achingly similar to the one that grew near their native Kermarivan. The narrow path leading to it was lost in the emerald green of the oats and wheat, and every time Jean Curterin would say to Luc le Gonaidac, "Just like ours, near Plounavon, the very image." They walked side by side, and vague memories of their village rose in their minds, pictures from the past, as simple as cheap popular prints. They seemed to see before them a patch of field, a hedge, a corner of the moorland, a crossroads, a granite cross. And every time they lingered by the boundary stones, for they bore a striking resemblance to the Lac Neuvin Dolmen. Upon reaching the first group of trees, Luc le Gonaidac would invariably cut a hazel switch and set about carefully stripping it, his thoughts returning to his fellow villagers. Jean Curterin carried the provisions. From time to time, Luc would drop a name, recount some childhood incident in 2 or 3 spare phrases, and this would plunge them into long reflection. And their native land, their dear and distant country, would gradually take hold of them, filling their souls, sending across the fields and woods its images, sounds, heart-wrenchingly familiar landscapes, its smells, the pungent scent of the moors, over which ran the salty sea wind. They no longer noticed the stench of Parisian sewage that fertilized the surrounding fields, but instead breathed in the fragrance of the flowering wild blackthorn, which mingled with the salty breath of the ocean and was carried along with it everywhere. And the sails of the boats, glimpsed beyond the high bank of the Seine, seemed to them like the sails of coasting vessels spotted at the end of the broad valley that stretched from their village right down to the water's edge. Luc le Gonaidac and Jean Curterin walked slowly, filled with a quiet, luminous despondency, gripped by the vague, profound melancholy of a captured animal. By the time Luke had finished stripping his slender hazel switch, they had invariably reached the edge of the wood, where they always breakfasted on Sundays. They would pull 2 bricks, hidden the previous week, from the bushes, light a fire of dry branches, and roast the sausage on the points of their knives. Having eaten every last crumb of bread and drained the wine to the final drop, the little soldiers remained sitting side by side on the grass. They gazed silently into the distance, their eyes growing heavy, their hands folded as if in prayer, and their legs in the red trousers stretched out among the field poppies. Their leather shakos and the brass buttons on their uniforms glittered brightly under the scorching sun, and this gleam captivated the skylarks, making them hover motionless for a moment in the air before soaring once more, trilling right above the soldiers' heads. As noon approached, they began to glance towards the village of Bezons, for soon the girl who came to milk the cow was due to appear. Every Sunday, she passed by them on her way to the one local cow that grazed not far off on the lush edge of the wood. Soon they would spot the farmhand, the only living soul in the field at that hour, and their hearts would leap with joy at the sight of the bright sunbeams dancing on her tin pail. They never spoke of her. They simply found it pleasant to look at her, though they didn't understand why themselves. She was a tall, strapping girl, red-haired, sunburned by the summer heat, a tall, lively country wench from the suburbs. One day, spotting them again in their usual place, she called out, "Well, look at you. Still here, then?" Luke Laganiduk, who was the bolder of the two, mumbled, "That's right. We're just sitting down for a bit." And with that, the conversation ended. But the following Sunday, upon seeing them, she laughed, a good-natured and patronizing laugh, like that of a spirited woman who has sensed a man's shyness. "So, what is it you do here?" she inquired. "Watching the grass grow, I suppose." Cheered up, Luke answered with a smile of his own. "Quite possibly." "Well, is it growing fast enough for you?" Laughing, he confirmed, "That's the truth." She went on her way. But upon returning with a full bucket of milk, she paused by them again and offered, "Would you like some milk? Have a sip, and it'll be like you're back home." Being of the same stock as them, she had intuitively guessed their homesickness and hit the mark. Or perhaps she too was pining for her native parts. The little soldiers were touched to the core. Carefully tilting her small bucket, she poured a little milk into the neck of their empty wine bottle. Luke was the first to drink, taking small sips and stealing glances to see how much was left for Jean. Then he passed the bottle to his comrade. The girl set her bucket on the ground and, planting her hands on her hips, stood before the soldiers, beaming with pleasure at having managed to delight them. Then she went on her way, calling out in farewell, "Right then, see you Sunday." They watched her go until her stately figure, shrinking into the distance, dissolved completely into the green expanse of the fields. And when a week later they left the barracks, Jean said, "We ought to thank her for something, bring her a little gift." For a long time, they racked their brains over what might please the girl who milked the cow. Luke was in favor of a piece of pork sausage, but Jean, who had a sweet tooth, leaned towards candy. His opinion won out, and they bought 2 sous worth of red and white striped sweets from the grocer. Agitated with anticipation, they got through their breakfast much faster than usual. Jean was the first to spot her. "There she is," he whispered. Luke confirmed, "That's her." Catching sight of them from afar, she laughed. "How are you getting on? Everything all right?" she called out. They answered in unison. "And with you?" She began talking to them about simple, familiar things, the weather, the harvest her employers. They, however, couldn't bring themselves to offer her the sweets, which were already beginning to melt softly in Jean's pocket. Finally, Luke, plucking up his courage, murmured barely audibly, "We, brought you something." She asked, "What is it?" Then Jean, flushing red to the tips of his ears, pulled out a crumpled paper cone and handed it to her. She immediately began sucking on the candies, rolling them in her mouth, which caused a funny bulge to swell out first in one cheek, then the other. The soldiers, sitting before her, gazed at her with rapturous tenderness. Then she went off to milk the cow, and on her way back, she gave them milk again. They thought of the girl all week, mentioning her in their talks. The next Sunday, she sat down beside them to chat a while longer, and all three, sitting in a row, gazing into the distance with their arms wrapped around their knees, began to recall the smallest events and details from the lives of their little villages. And the cow, seeing that its maidservant was delayed, stretched its heavy, damp muzzle in her direction and lowed, calling for her. Time passed, and soon the girl agreed to share their modest breakfast and take a sip of wine. Now she often brought them plums in her pocket, for their season had just arrived. In her presence, the Breton soldiers grew animated and began to chirp like birds. And then one Tuesday, Luke Ganidek asked for and received a whole day's leave, something that had never happened before, and didn't return until 10 o'clock in the evening. Anxious, Jean was racking his brains, trying to guess what business had taken his friend away. That Friday, Luke, having borrowed 10 sous from his bunkmate, once again asked for and received a few hours' leave. And when he and Jean set off on their Sunday pilgrimage, Luke was not himself, agitated, strangely excited. Curterin could make nothing of it. A vague, heavy foreboding stirred within him, though he hadn't yet guessed the truth. Not a word was spoken until they reached their cherished spot, where the grass was now thoroughly trampled down. Their Sunday breakfast dragged on slowly and listlessly. Neither of them felt like eating. Soon the girl appeared. As usual, they watched her approach. When she drew near, Luke suddenly stood up and took a step towards her. She set her bucket down and kissed the young man passionately, wrapping her sun-tanned arms around his neck, paying not the slightest attention to Jean, as if she had forgotten him, as if he weren't there at all. And poor Jean was stupefied with amazement. His mind grew clouded. He was stunned, feeling his heart break apart, though he did not yet fully understand why. Then the girl sat down next to Luke, and they immersed themselves in animated conversation. Jean did not look at them. He now understood why his friend had been absent the previous week, and he was seized by an oppressive, heart-wrenching sorrow, born of betrayal, while somewhere deep in his soul a burning pain throbbed, like that of a wound that would not heal. Luke and the girl stood up and went together towards the cow. Jean watched them unblinkingly. He saw them walk away, side by side. Luke's scarlet trousers made a bright spot on the path. Then Luke picked up a wooden mallet lying on the ground and drove the tethering peg deeper into the earth. The girl, bending over, began to milk the cow, while Luke absently ran his hand along the animal's bony spine. Then, leaving the bucket of milk on the grass, they disappeared into the thick of the wood. Jean saw nothing more but the foliage that closed behind them. He was so shaken that his legs would have buckled had he tried to stand. He sat motionless, numb with astonishment and grief, a naive, all-consuming grief. He wanted to sob, to run away without looking back, to hide, to vanish, never to see anyone again. Suddenly, he noticed them emerging from the thicket. They returned at a leisurely pace, holding hands, exactly like a bride and groom at a village festival. Luke was carrying the bucket. They kissed once more in farewell, and the girl departed, tossing Jean a brief, conspiratorial nod. It did not even occur to her to offer him any milk that day. The little soldiers remained sitting side by side, as motionless, silent, and calm as ever. Not a shadow of the feelings tormenting them from within could be read on their impassive faces. The sun beat down. The cow, watching them from afar, lowed. At the usual hour, they rose and started back. Luke was habitually stripping a hazel switch. Jean carried the empty bottle. In Bezins, he went to the wine merchant's to return it. Then they turned onto the bridge and, as always, stopped in the middle to gaze at the flowing water. Jean leaned further and further over the cast-iron railing, as if something in the dark water were irresistibly drawing him down. Luke asked, "Don't tell me you're thinking of taking a drink of water?" The words were scarcely out of his mouth when Jean's head overbalanced his heavy body. His legs described a short arc in the air, and the little soldier in his blue and red uniform plummeted into the river and vanished into its depths. Luke tried to cry out, but horror stole his voice. He saw the water churn suddenly, his comrade's head break the surface for an instant, only to disappear again. A second later, he saw a hand, just a single hand, that emerged from the water for a moment and then sank powerlessly beneath it. And that was all. The boatman who hurried to the spot never found his body that day. Luke ran back to the barracks alone, beside himself, and, choking on tears, endlessly sniffing and wiping his wet face, recounted the misfortune. He leaned over like this, head first, and suddenly he fell. He could not utter another word. So great was his despair. If only he had known,